Okay, so here we are. So this is our experiment in digital education. I'm not sure exactly this is what people intended, but we're going to try it today to see if we can make it work. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and start with a little lesson. I'm going to ask that you guys pay attention to short sections here, and then I'll have some questions for you to answer and some things for you to do. And then by the end of it, hopefully we'll advance. The idea is that in my absence that we won't fall behind in class and you can continue to move forward. Okay, so to start today, I want to go back to a little bit about Daniel Shays. So when you think about Daniel Shays, the big issue that Daniel Shays' rebellion presents, or his uprising presents, is that the government, under the Articles of Confederation, are in no way capable of dealing with these crises. Think back to the conflict we talked about yesterday with New York and New Jersey. You think about the issues that Shay himself faced. Here was a tax that the people felt was totally illegitimate, that it was too much, too high, discriminatory against farmers, and suddenly they have no way of doing anything about it, except uprising, rising up. If you think back, this is in some ways what we talked about, but all the way back to Bacon's Rebellion. You know, remember what the whole idea was with Bacon, was that when the government doesn't serve our needs, it's an Enlightenment idea that you're going to see keep coming up over and over again. The government serves with the consent of the governed and serves a functional purpose with the government. So in this case, we've got a situation where Shays is saying this government is not meeting my needs, so we're going to rise up and we're going to take them out. The problem for us now as a nation is that you can't just have the people going and picking which laws they're going to follow and which they don't. That's no way to run a country. The other countries, Britain is right around the corner, with their forts ready to go. They could be attacking us at any minute. You got Spain. Spain's already irritated. You saw what they were doing with the right of deposit yesterday. So what we're going to talk about now is what the answer will become for us. As we mentioned at the meeting at Annapolis, the folks who did gather had said, if things are not resolved and aren't significantly better, then the next time we gather, let's gather in Philadelphia with the intent of fixing or revising the Articles of Confederation. So that's where we end up in Philadelphia. Now, when we go to Philly later this year, we're actually going to be going to some of these places, and I'm going to step out of camera periodically so we can talk about some of this. So you've got an issue here of what's going to be happening, the decision in Philadelphia. Okay, so in Philadelphia, I'm going to put a little bit this way so we get more of the board on there. Okay, Philadelphia, what we have is a situation where the people who are elected by their respective states are going to come to Philadelphia with the intention of amending the Articles of Confederation. So if you look at the word amend here, and this is a very important word that you have to know, amend means to revise, to change, to add on. So to amend was the idea, what they intended to do, their intentional gathering point was to come together and try to make appropriate changes in a way that they could fix the problems. Now this is critical. This gentleman right here, George Washington, were it not for George being in attendance, I don't know that this thing would have worked, because the one advantage we had with a figure like a George Washington was there was not a person in the colonies who believed George Washington would have anything to do with a gathering or an event that was going to be problematic. So what's happening here is you've got George in attendance. For most of the people, this felt like something that was like, okay, I may not like this idea, but since George is there, he's kind of like grandpa, everything will be fine. So you see him gather. Just to sort of show you a little bit what's going on here. Here is Independence Hall. This is famous from the place where we would have declared independence. We're going to gather back there in the same room, the room where it happened, the same room that we were for the Declaration. We're going to gather now to try to figure out if there isn't a better way of governing. So this is where we'll be going later on this year, the end of February, when we go on our trip. So in Philadelphia, the meeting was going to take place where they will agree to gather. All the colonies this time will send members and send people eventually. They don't always, and at first they don't, for example, Rhode Island doesn't send anybody at first, but you're going to see them in attendance. Now this meeting, and this is Independence Hall today, that was a picture of what it looked like back in. the three characters, the three individuals that you need to be particularly aware of, and I have to kind of tip it down like this, are going to be, first of all, right over here, this is Benjamin Franklin. He is 81 years old. He is the host. He is the person who is considered the sort of the most, sort of like the grandfatherly figure next to Washington. He was at the original Declaration Convention, you know, when we declare independence, Second Continental Convention. So that's it. You've got James Madison. James Madison is going to be the figure who will become really essential at this point in time, because he is the person who is going to be responsible for writing the new document that we use. Hamilton. Okay, moment for all the Hamilton applause. Applause, applause, applause. Hamilton, 33-year-old, young, upcoming, brash guy who is really a genius. I'm going to, in full disclosure, you will see very quickly that I do not apologize for my admiration of Hamilton. I'm a huge Hamilton fan. And then the guy we talked about before, Robert Morris, who was the financier who had helped us literally survive the revolution, was one of the people who was responsible for us surviving it. And they will all be in attendance, and they will serve a very important role. You've got sort of the person who adds gravitas and sort of that institutional or that historical information perspective. You've got the two people who are going to be responsible for a lot of the early changes. And then you've got somebody like Morris who had more of the economic sort of motivation and elements behind him. Now, when we look at the people in attendance, this is a painting that was done of the people who attended the Constitutional Convention. And up here, if you look at the top here, the Maryland representatives. I only mention that because I think it's important to point out when our representatives were involved in something. These are the folks who come from Maryland. Daniel of St. Thomas Jenifer, Daniel Carroll, and James McHenry. Those will be the Maryland delegates who will be at this convention or at this event. Mostly we know that there are 55 delegates who will attend this convention at any given time. These 55 delegates will be there most of the time. When you think about who these people represent, they really are representative of pretty much the best and the brightest of us. You know, I put up here, and you can look down in your notes, you see sort of these elements of who was there. Governors, planters, lawyers, professors. Really were the best and the brightest of a generation. And so in some ways, when you see this gathering, it's really tremendous when you think about, I think after the fact, what they were able to achieve and what they do, because it's extraordinary that people in power, people of privilege, are going to create a democracy that will give tremendous power and influence to the people who in other situations in other governments would never have had those same opportunities. More interesting to me than who was there is who was not. And this is where it gets, I think something that you should pay close attention to. When you look at who wasn't there, first and foremost, Jefferson and Adams. This is a question. You see people on every kind of quiz show in the world get this question wrong, because everybody assumes that Jefferson and Adams were at the Constitutional Convention. Neither of them were there. In fact, they're not there. They are representing the United States under the Articles of Confederation as ambassadors to other countries. Adams is in England. He is in England representing us. Very difficult job. I don't think anybody would have liked that job. If you watch the John Adams series on, I think it was Amazon Prime, if you watch that series, you see this phase where Adams has this very, very difficult relationship and very difficult time in London representing the colonies. Because again, we just, we got these issues, having just broken off from them. Jefferson, on the other hand, is living the high life. He is living in Paris. He's a celebrity. Everybody wants to dine with him. Everybody wants to go out with him. He's really living very, very large over there. They will be gone this entire time. And in many ways, I think part of Jefferson's issues, and he will have a lot of issues with the Constitution, a lot of his issues are going to stem from the fact that he was not here and was not part of what was coming. The other two figures that I want to point out that are not present are Patrick Henry, and Sam Adams. Now, if you think back, and I'm going to give you a minute to think back about what we know about both of these figures. They're both important revolutionary figures, but they're not known for their passive opinions. They're people who promoted very clearly a an agenda that they believe was the right agenda to pursue. So what happens is they're not even invited because we didn't need people that came in with an agenda or a vision of what had to happen. We needed people who could compromise. And that's one of the critical elements that comes out of this. And that's one of the things that's going to come out of this. The other thing, and the other group I want to point out here that is not present, literally is a delegation from Rhode Island. Rhode Island said, we're not going to go. We're not going to show up. Nothing can be done if we're not there. It isn't going to change because, again, what is required for change? Unanimity, okay? A unanimous vote. Good. Okay, so again, we talk about this just to sort of make sure you've got this down somewhere, and it's in your notes. We've got Jefferson is in France, Adams is in England, Patrick Henry and Sam Adams considered too controversial for this particular gathering. Now, to explain this next part is really important to understand because we would typically use a word to describe this gathering as extra legal. EXTRA, extra legal, meaning outside of the normal legal bounds that's authorized by a government. So there was a question about whether or not this gathering was a legitimate gathering in the first place, because there were some people who don't believe it is. Like, for example, Sam Adams and Patrick Henry both have strong concerns that this is an illegal gathering. You might even be more suspicious when you learn about some of the elements that occurred during this meeting. So if you look at this meeting in terms of what's occurring, when they gathered, they locked the doors. They locked the doors like our back there, back of the room, and people were not allowed in or out while discussions were underway. They were not allowed to take any notes or anything that they wrote down during the course of the meeting, because they were not allowed to take those outside of the room. The windows were closed. Now remember, they are meeting May through the summer. It is hot. They've got their wool outfits on. This is not a great sort of lovely location. It must have been ripe in that room, because remember, they also don't wear deodorant. So that's another issue, but that's another story. There was a concern that somebody, like the press, might hang outside of these windows here and might try to listen in and hear what was going on. So rather than partial information or inaccurate information getting out in the public sphere, what they did was they set it up in a way that they didn't have anybody going in or out. They feared that if the news got out about what they were doing, that it would cause real problems for them. The other concern, and this is actually something that I think is really interesting when we think about debates today, is this idea is that they feared the ability of these delegates to be able to change their mind. If you stop and think for a minute about one of the issues we have in Congress today, is that there's always a concern that if I, say I'm your elected official, that I, as your elected official, might change my mind. I might decide I believe X about an issue. And then I listen to somebody present information. And I listen to it and I'm like, wow, that's a really great point. I'm going to switch. I think I'm going to evolve and I'm going to take that position. Now, in normal life, that's a good thing. I want to do something one way. You guys come and say, that's not how we really want to do it. Let's try it this. I might take it in and maybe it is a really good idea, so I can change my mind. But when you're an elected official, what happens is if you change your mind, what is often portrayed in the press is that you're easily influenced, you're wishy-washy, that you don't have that. So what happened was they were afraid that as people presented their ideas, there wouldn't be a natural evolution of their ideas as things were going on. So that was one of the concerns, that if they said something, and the other thing is I want you to think about the other way that this might work, is that I want you to think about in your own life. Have you ever taken a position where you come out really strong and say, I disagree, and you make this big stand about, this is what I think. And then you listen to the other side and you realize, you know what? They're right. I kind of am wrong here. But because you made such a big to-do about it and such a big presentation, you kind of stuck. Most of us don't have the humility to be able to say, you know what? My bad, I was wrong. A lot of us will just double down on being wrong rather than because we feel like we have to, because we made such a big stink about it. So here's one of the things that starts happening. They didn't want them to feel that way. They wanted these people to be able to change their minds. If Virginia wants something, but Massachusetts comes up with a better plan or a different way of doing it, they wanted the people from Virginia to be able to change their minds. So they also wanted people from each of the states to be able to think about the country versus the state. Now, this is a little harder to explain, but think back to one of the problems that we had under the Articles. And under the Articles, one of the consistent problems that we have is that people present themselves as members of, or see themselves as members of a state. I am from Virginia. So when I make decisions, I always think with Virginia first, right? Well, the problem with thinking of Virginia first is yes, it's good for Virginia, but it hurts everybody else. Is that really the right thing to do? Well, we're now moving to, as a national model, making decisions that affect the whole versus any individual state's needs. And that's where they wanted the people who are planning this, they want people to be able to consider the good of the nation, not just their states. But they don't want it to get back to the states so that they get in trouble with the people of the state, because I believe personally that this is better for the country if we do it this way. But if the people of Virginia found out I voted for something that was not necessarily good for Virginia, but good for the country, then I might be in trouble. So they wanted people to be able to have that chance to do that. They passed some other rules that I think are pretty fascinating. Voting rules. Each delegation, that is each state, had a chance to vote one time. So the delegation could have conservatives, could have different members who were more progressive in what they were thinking. They had to all come to some sort of agreement, and that's how they would vote. Each person could be heard on every issue a maximum of 2 times. Because, same problems we have today, they didn't want debates being controlled by 1 or 2 people. The other thing to keep in mind is they passed no whispering, no note passing, and no reading during it, because they wanted everybody really focused on it. There was a real awareness that what they were doing was extraordinary. But here's the question that I ask for you. Is this a coup d'etat? Now, you may not know what a coup d'etat is. A coup d'etat is a government overthrow. Was this, in fact, an overthrow of the government? Was the meeting in Philadelphia legit? You could make the argument that they had to do it or we wouldn't make it. Does that justify them doing so? That's a question. So I want you to take a couple of minutes and I want you to think about that, because Patrick Henry said, "I smell a rat." And he was very clear that what they were doing was illegal. Remember, Rhode Island's not there. You've got a number of people, and the purpose that they're coming together is to amend the Articles of Confederation. Nothing more. But what's going to happen in this room, and I'm not ready to stop yet, so hold on a second. What's going to happen in this room is the question I will bring you: is it a coup d'etat? Because what happens next is Edmund Randolph basically comes forward and says, "I think we need a national government." Not one of the articles. I think we need a new system, and we need a national government that has power and has strength. Randolph said a national government ought to be established, and he will promote it. In other words, he was suggesting that the articles were out. There was the Governor Morris at the time will actually support this whole notion, and he basically says this quote that I think is pretty telling. He said, "We had better take a supreme government now than a despot," which is another name for a tyrant, 20 years hence, for come he must. So if this is what we're talking about now, we're talking about the articles out, making way for what will become the Constitution. So if they go into this meeting with the intention of throwing the articles out, from the very beginning, there's a question about legitimacy. Is this, in fact, a legal meeting, or is it an illegal meeting? I want you to take a couple minutes, and I want you to talk with the person at your seat and to discuss whether or not you think this is appropriate, whether or not it was a coup d'etat. And we'll talk more about that on Thursday. Talk for a couple minutes, and then we'll go on to the next part.